May 8th, 1945, 07:20 hours. Camp 174, Lancashire, England. Sergeant William Brown carried a bundle of newspapers through the camp gates as he'd done hundreds of mornings before. The Daily Mail, the Times, the Manchester Guardian. British authorities permitted newspapers in POW camps, believing that accurate information was preferable to rumours and speculation. Brown's delivery routine was prosaic. Drop papers at the camp office, watch German prisoners collect them, continue with morning duties. This morning was different. Brown glanced at the Daily Mail's headline as he walked. Germany surrenders. The Reich is finished. Hitler dead. Unconditional capitulation to Allies. The words were massive, dominating the front page with finality that permitted no ambiguity. The war in Europe was over. Germany had lost absolutely. Brown entered the camp compound, where perhaps 200 German prisoners were gathering for morning roll call. The routine was familiar. Prisoners assembled in formation. British guards counted heads. Work details were assigned. Breakfast was distributed. But Brown knew this morning's routine would be disrupted by the newspapers he carried, and he wasn't certain how German prisoners would respond to learning their nation had surrendered unconditionally. He placed the newspaper bundle on a table near the camp office and stepped back. German prisoners who'd been standing in formation broke ranks immediately, drawn to the newspapers like sailors to land after long voyage. The first man to reach the table was an older Unteroffizier named Fritz Weber, who'd been captured in Normandy and served as informal leader among prisoners. Weber picked up the Daily Mail, stared at the headline for perhaps 5 seconds, then made a sound somewhere between gasp and groan. Other prisoners crowded around, reading over Weber's shoulder or grabbing additional newspapers. Brown watched their faces transform as they processed the information. Some went pale. Others' expressions hardened into masks that revealed nothing. One young soldier, barely 20, captured only weeks earlier, began crying silently, tears running down his face while he stood motionless, newspaper trembling in his hands. The compound became absolutely silent. 200 German prisoners stood frozen, each processing the headline's implications in isolation, despite being surrounded by comrades. Brown had expected celebration, relief, perhaps even some anger. Instead, he witnessed something more profound and disturbing: collective psychological collapse as ideology confronted reality and lost completely. Weber finally spoke, his voice carrying across the silent compound. It is over. The simple statement seemed to release tension, and suddenly everyone was talking simultaneously, some insisting the headline must be propaganda, others saying they'd known Germany would lose, a few demanding more newspapers to verify the information. The chaos lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Weber raised his hand for silence. The prisoners quieted immediately, their discipline holding despite everything. The newspapers do not lie like this, Weber said quietly. Not about something so important. If the Daily Mail says Germany has surrendered, then Germany has surrendered. The war is over. We lost. He paused, looking at the men around him. Now, we must decide who we will be in the peace. Brown would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The instant when 200 enemy soldiers collectively acknowledged their nation's total defeat and began the psychological transformation from combatants to defeated survivors. The foundation of disbelief. The German prisoners in British camps during spring 1945 existed in peculiar information vacuum. They received news primarily through 3 sources: rumors from newly captured prisoners, occasional letters from Germany that had been heavily censored, and British newspapers that camp authorities provided. Each source was unreliable in different ways. Newly captured prisoners brought reports from the front, but these reports were fragmentary and often contradicted each other. One prisoner might describe devastating Allied advances, while another, from different sector, reported successful German defensive actions. The prisoners had no means of assembling these fragments into a coherent picture of overall military situation. They knew Germany was losing ground. That much was obvious from the fact that they'd been captured on German soil rather than in occupied territories, but they didn't know how badly the war was going. Letters from home were worse than useless for understanding military situation. German censors removed anything militarily relevant before letters left Germany, and British censors reviewed them again before delivery to prisoners. What remained was personal news. Family members were safe or missing. Cities were damaged by bombing. Food was scarce. That provided no strategic context. British newspapers were most reliable source, but also most suspect. The prisoners knew the newspapers were accurate about verifiable facts: battle locations, unit identifications, general military movements. But they also assumed newspapers contained propaganda exaggerating Allied successes and minimizing German capabilities. When newspapers reported German setbacks, prisoners discounted the reports as psychological warfare designed to demoralize them. This information environment created space for Nazi true believers among prisoners to maintain influence by dismissing negative reports as Allied propaganda while emphasizing any positive news as proof that Germany would ultimately prevail. The true believers spoke confidently about Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons that would reverse the war's course. They cited Hitler's promises about German victory and insisted that temporary setbacks were part of strategic plan leading to final triumph. The moderate prisoners, men who'd begun questioning Nazi ideology through combat experience and British treatment during captivity, found themselves unable to definitively prove the true believers wrong. Yes, Germany appeared to be losing, but proving that Germany had already lost required information the prisoners didn't possess. The true believers exploited this uncertainty, maintaining their psychological influence over wavering prisoners through confident assertions that events were unfolding according to plan. This dynamic made the May 8th newspaper delivery devastating to German prisoners' collective psychology. The headline wasn't reporting a battle or a setback, it was announcing absolute, final, unconditional defeat. There was no way to interpret Germany surrenders as temporary setback or propaganda exaggeration. The event was either true or false, and the prisoners would learn the truth quickly because such a claim couldn't be sustained if it were false. The initial reactions. The first hour after newspaper distribution revealed the range of psychological responses that German prisoners could display when confronting the collapse of everything they'd believed about the war's trajectory. The deniers rejected the information immediately. Hauptmann Friedrich Braun, a Wehrmacht officer who'd maintained Nazi loyalty throughout captivity, insisted loudly that the headline was British psychological warfare. "They want us demoralized before peace negotiations," he told anyone who would listen. "Germany has been negotiating surrender terms, not surrendering unconditionally. The British are lying to make us think the situation is worse than reality." Braun's confidence wavered when another prisoner asked the obvious question: why would British authorities lie about something prisoners would learn the truth about within days, at most? If Germany hadn't surrendered, German radio would continue broadcasting. New prisoners would continue arriving. Letters from Germany would contradict the claim. The lie would be exposed immediately, making British authorities look foolish. The logic suggested the headline must be accurate. The silent group stood or sat motionless, staring at newspapers or into empty space, processing implications without speaking. Werner Hartmann, who'd been captured at Caen in 1944 and spent nearly a year in British captivity, stood with newspaper in hand for 20 minutes, reading the same headline repeatedly as though repetition might change the words. He didn't speak, didn't move, appeared to be in shock from information overload. Later, Hartmann would describe his thoughts during those 20 minutes. I had believed Germany would lose eventually. British treatment during captivity had shown me that Nazi propaganda about British brutality was lies, and if that was lies, perhaps everything was lies. But knowing intellectually that Germany would lose was different from seeing the words "Germany surrenders" in newspaper headline. That made it real in a way nothing else had. Everything I'd fought for, everyone who died, the 6 years of war, all of it ended with newspaper headline announcing our complete defeat. The relieved group's response was immediate and visceral. Hans Schmidt, captured in North Africa in 1943, read the headline and immediately sat down heavily, as though strings supporting him had been cut. "Thank God," he said quietly. "Thank God, it's finally over." Schmidt had spent 2 years in captivity, watching new prisoners arrive with reports of continued fighting. Knowing that comrades were still dying in war, everyone knew was lost. The surrender meant the dying would stop. Several prisoners in the relieved group began crying, not from grief, but from release of tension they'd carried for months or years. One young soldier, who'd been captured only weeks earlier, sobbed uncontrollably, repeating, "It's over, it's over," while other prisoners watched awkwardly, uncertain how to respond. The emotional release was profound and slightly embarrassing for men trained to maintain military bearing regardless of circumstances. The fearful group's response was quieter, but equally visible. These prisoners worried less about Germany's defeat than about what defeat meant for them personally. Where would they be repatriated? What would remain of their homes? What would happen in Soviet-occupied zones? What punishment would former soldiers face? The defeat created uncertainty about future that was more frightening than the certainty of present captivity. Gustav Schneider, captured at Arnhem, voiced concerns that others shared. If Germany has surrendered to Soviets as well as Western allies, what happens to Germans in Soviet zones? The British treat us fairly. The Soviets... He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew Soviet treatment of German prisoners was brutal compared to British standards. The fear that they might be handed over to Soviet custody was palpable among prisoners from Eastern Germany. The British response. British guards and camp administrators watched German prisoners' reactions with carefully maintained professional distance. They'd been instructed to allow prisoners to process the information without interference, but to maintain order and prevent any violence that might erupt from heightened emotions. Captain Robert Ashford, the camp commander, had anticipated various possible prisoner responses to news of German surrender. He'd prepared for celebration. Some prisoners might be relieved the war was over. He'd prepared for violence. Hardline Nazis might attack prisoners who expressed relief. He'd prepared for escape attempts. Desperate prisoners might try to flee before learning their fate. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the depth of psychological shock that rendered most prisoners temporarily passive and silent. Ashford walked through the compound during the first hour after newspaper distribution, observing prisoner reactions without overtly intervening. He noticed that hardline Nazi sympathizers who'd been influential in camp hierarchy were suddenly isolated. Other prisoners avoided them or ignored their assertions that the surrender was temporary or that Germany would regroup for continued resistance. The social dynamics that had maintained Nazi ideology's influence collapsed within minutes of headline delivery. British guards received instructions to maintain normal routines. Morning roll calls still occurred, work details still assembled, meals still served on schedule. The routine provided structure that helped prisoners process shocking information within familiar framework. Some prisoners went through routine mechanically, performing tasks without apparent thought. Others seemed grateful for routine's distraction from overwhelming news. The guards' restraint was notable. They didn't celebrate Germany's defeat in prisoners' presence, didn't mock German prisoners for their nation's loss, didn't exploit the psychological vulnerability that prisoners were experiencing. The professional distance was calculated. British authorities believed that dignified treatment of defeated enemies would facilitate eventual peace and reduce likelihood of future conflict. Sergeant Brown distributed tea during mid-morning break, a routine gesture that acquired additional significance given circumstances. German prisoners accepted the tea quietly, some nodding thanks, others too stunned to acknowledge the gesture. One prisoner asked Brown if the newspaper report was accurate. Brown's response was simple. It's accurate. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The prisoner nodded slowly, absorbing the confirmation, then asked the question that mattered most. What happens to us now? Brown gave the only honest answer he could. You'll be held here until repatriation can be arranged, probably several months. Conditions won't change. You'll continue working, receiving meals, being treated according to Geneva Conventions. Eventually, you'll go home. What they actually said. British camp administrators maintained detailed logs of prisoner behavior and conversations during the days following Germany's surrender announcement. These logs, combined with post-war interviews with former prisoners, preserved record of what German POWs actually said when confronting their nation's total defeat. Everything they told us was lies. This statement appeared repeatedly in various forms. Prisoners who'd believed Nazi propaganda about inevitable German victory, about Wunderwaffe that would change the war's course, about Allied weakness and internal divisions. All these beliefs collapsed simultaneously when faced with undeniable evidence of complete defeat. The realization that they'd been systematically deceived produced anger, disillusionment, and sometimes relief. At least we're in British hands. Many prisoners expressed explicit gratitude that they'd been captured by British rather than Soviet forces. British treatment during captivity, adequate food, medical care, fair discipline, protection from abuse, had demonstrated civilization that prisoners knew wasn't universal among Allied forces. The knowledge that they'd survive captivity and be repatriated rather than disappearing into Soviet labor camps was genuinely comforting. What happens to my family? This question dominated conversations after initial shock wore off. Germany's defeat meant cities had been occupied, governments had collapsed, and social order had been disrupted. Prisoners worried about parents, wives, children living in areas they knew had been heavily bombed or were now under Soviet control. The inability to contact families or learn their fate created anxiety that overwhelmed prisoners' concerns about their own situations. I'm glad it's over. Multiple prisoners expressed relief that fighting had ended, even if it meant Germany's defeat. They'd known the war was lost for months or years, but had also known that comrades continued dying in futile combat. The surrender meant no more deaths, no more destruction, no more pointless resistance. For many prisoners, this relief outweighed their distress at Germany's defeat. We deserved to lose. This statement was less common but significant when it appeared. Some prisoners had concluded during captivity that Germany had fought for evil regime, pursuing evil goals. British fair treatment had demonstrated moral superiority that made these prisoners question everything they'd believed about Nazi ideology. For them, Germany's defeat was both inevitable and just. What are we now? This existential question troubled many prisoners deeply. They'd been German soldiers fighting for their nation. Now their nation had surrendered unconditionally and would be occupied by victorious enemies. Were they still soldiers? Were they criminals for having fought for Nazi regime? Were they Germans who'd failed their country, or Germans liberated from evil government? The uncertainty about identity was profound and troubling. The divided camp. By afternoon, the prisoner population had sorted itself into distinct groups based on how they responded to Germany's defeat. The divisions weren't formal or openly acknowledged, but they were obvious to anyone observing camp social dynamics. The acceptance group comprised roughly half the prisoners, men who acknowledged Germany's defeat and began focusing on practical concerns about repatriation and rebuilding. These prisoners asked guards about timeline for returning home, discussed what they'd find when they reached Germany, and began making plans for post-war lives. Fritz Weber emerged as informal spokesman for this group, his calm acceptance of defeat providing model for others struggling with shock. Weber's influence derived partly from his age. He was 43, older than most prisoners, and partly from respect he'd earned through fair leadership during captivity. When Weber stated flatly that Germany had lost and prisoners needed to accept that reality, many prisoners found his certainty reassuring. He wasn't celebrating defeat or condemning Germany, just acknowledging facts and suggesting practical approaches to dealing with new reality. The denial group was smaller but vocal, consisting primarily of younger prisoners who'd been heavily indoctrinated before capture, and recent captives who hadn't spent enough time in British custody to question Nazi ideology thoroughly. These prisoners insisted that newspaper reports were exaggerated or false, that Germany would regroup and continue fighting, that surrender was temporary negotiating position rather than final defeat. Friedrich Braun led this group, though his influence was deteriorating rapidly. When he claimed that Germany had secret weapons that would reverse the war's outcome, other prisoners asked pointed questions. If Germany possessed such weapons, why hadn't they been used before Germany was invaded and occupied? If Germany was still capable of continued resistance, why had Hitler's government surrendered unconditionally? The logical inconsistencies in denial position became harder to ignore as prisoners discussed them. The conflicted group comprised prisoners who accepted intellectually that Germany had lost but struggled emotionally with implications. These men understood the war was over, but hadn't processed what that meant for their identities, their futures, or their understanding of the past 6 years. They wandered camp restlessly, sometimes joining conversations with acceptance group, sometimes listening to denial group's arguments, never settling on clear position. The isolated group, hardline Nazi ideologists who'd maintained rigid loyalty despite everything, found themselves suddenly marginalized. Prisoners who'd previously deferred to them or tolerated their pronouncements now avoided them or openly dismissed their views. The social authority that Nazi true believers had maintained through confidence and aggression evaporated when their predictions of German victory were conclusively proven false. The final accounting. The May 8, 1945 newspaper delivery at Camp 174 wasn't militarily significant. Germany had already surrendered before German POWs learned about it. But it was psychologically significant for thousands of German prisoners who experienced ideology's collision with reality in that moment. The newspaper headline was undeniable proof that everything Nazi regime had promised was false. Germany hadn't won. The Wunderwaffe hadn't appeared. The Allied coalition hadn't collapsed. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and ended in unconditional surrender. For prisoners who'd believed Nazi propaganda, despite growing doubts, the headline eliminated all remaining uncertainty about who'd won the war and what that meant for Germany. British authorities' decision to provide newspapers rather than delaying information demonstrated confidence in their approach to POW treatment. They believed, correctly, that German prisoners who learned about defeat through accurate information while experiencing fair treatment would be less likely to nurture resentment or support future conflict. The strategy worked. Prisoners who might have clung to Nazi ideology, if kept in darkness, were forced to confront reality through undeniable evidence of absolute defeat. Sergeant Brown, who delivered the newspapers that morning, reflected on the moment decades later. I expected chaos or celebration. Instead, I witnessed something more profound. The exact moment when ideology died and reality replaced it. 200 German soldiers faced absolute proof that everything they'd fought for had failed completely. That psychological shock was more dramatic than any military battle I'd seen. And British response, maintaining dignity, treating prisoners with continued fairness, demonstrated that victory doesn't require humiliation. We'd defeated them militarily. We proved we'd defeated them morally by treating them better than their own government had treated anyone. The German prisoners who read British newspapers on May 8, 1945, experienced the war's end, not through military operations or government announcements, but through newspaper headline stating facts they couldn't deny. Their responses ranged from denial to relief to grief, but virtually all of them moved eventually toward acceptance that the war was over and Germany had lost absolutely. What they said in those moments, everything was lies. At least we're in British hands. I'm glad it's over, revealed psychological transformation from combatants to survivors, from believers in Nazi ideology to disillusioned realists, from soldiers to civilians preparing for uncertain peace. The transformation occurred because newspaper headline removed all remaining doubt about war's outcome, forcing prisoners to confront reality that Nazi propaganda had obscured for years. The story ended not with battle, but with newspaper, with words on paper that announced the war's conclusion and forced German prisoners to begin the difficult psychological work of accepting defeat and imagining peace. It was appropriately anticlimactic ending to conflict that had consumed 6 years and millions of lives. The fighting stopped, not with grand gesture, but with simple statement of fact. Germany surrenders. The Reich is finished. The war is over. And 200 German prisoners standing in British POW camp compound, holding newspapers and confronting truth, began the long process of determining who they would be in the peace.